Hi everyone, this is Arthi from Human Chapters. Humans are living narratives with a past, present, and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these conversations is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a worthy story to share. An acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which now comprises Greater Shepparton. We pay respect to the tribal elders, past and present and emerging. We celebrate their continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. Today, we are going to be talking to Robert and Joseph, and their chapter is A Journey in Education. Go for it, guys. Feel free to.
I just want to start off with she is genius for writing down her introduction because we have an introduction to our podcast and we always mess it up and have to re-record the intro. And I always make fun of Robert mercilessly for this. But you just wrote it down. I don't know why we never thought of that. Why didn't we think of that, Robert?
Well, actually, I thought of that because I like to do things with a lot more structure. But I've learned to go with the flow, working with Joseph here. And I think we're better for that kind of balance between our personalities has really helped all of our projects that we've done together. So
there you go. Non-drama. Please introduce yourselves. What do you do and why this chapter?
Okay. Do you want to go first or second, Robert?
I'll go first.
All right, let's hear it.
So I would say when I introduce myself, I always introduce myself as a teacher first. I feel like my journey has been a long journey, getting to the point where I was able to really call myself a teacher. And so that is the title that I always hold. So I'm going to introduce myself as a teacher first. But getting toward that point took a lot of searching my identity and things like that. I was born in Canada, lived all my life in Durham, but I come from two immigrant parents. And so I was always at this kind of intersection in terms of identity. And then I have many aspects to my background and heritage. And I think in searching all of that led me on a path through education. And I started in medicine and I followed really a track that was kind of laid out for me from my parents. And once I had reached fully down that track and I felt like I had shown my parents the respect that I was raised to show them, I felt like at that point I was comfortable with asking permission really to do what I wanted to do, what I imagined would really complete my identity and be my passion, and that was teaching. And that led me to Lakehead, which happens to be the same institution where Joseph here went to Teachers College. We weren't at the same time. I'm a little older than him. And I would say that experience led me to my first teaching experience, which was on a First Nation reserve. And that's where I met Joseph. So I'll let Joseph introduce himself and kind of tie that knot there.
Yeah. I think I'm going to be a little more long-winded than Robert, which is funny because we're both very talkative people, but it's really hard to say who's the bigger gabber, to be honest. But
I think
is it me? I don't know. I think it might be you, but that's okay. Sometimes it's me. So I will say right before I met Robert, I was a teacher, but I was way more interested in personal fitness than I was teaching. Wasn't even sure I wanted to stay a teacher. It was just all kind of, it was a career, but it wasn't like a passion yet. And it did become a passion after I met Robert, but was way more in fitness. And I was obsessed with benching as the most pound weight because I wanted to be a really competitive powerlifter. that dream died because I realized I'm not that good, genetically speaking. But it led me to this like path of like getting really into the science of lifting weights because I wasn't that good. So I wanted to get better and I wanted to use science to my advantage, which is the story of anybody who's ever interested in personal fitness and the science of lifting. And I started teaching, and I went to this northern community, indigenous community in Canada. And Robert was there too. He came a little bit after me, actually. And I remember the day I first met Robert. It was kind of a funny experience. He was starting to tell me about experiences he had with discrimination in his life, as you know, as a person who's non-white. And I remember being kind of surprised and almost a little dubious of that experience because it just hadn't been my own personal experience. Because as a person of privilege who was white, I really hadn't seen that in my life. And you know, living in that indigenous community, in that northern community, I started to see examples of discrimination every single day. And it was kind of you know, a shocker to me. I especially thought, you know, growing up in a privileged house, I thought racism was only a product of ignorance, and that people who were educated were never racist. And that was what I was just raised to believe. And I became to realize, oh, that's really not true. I was wrong. And then, you know, I sort of became really passionate about this community I was living in and working in, and I wanted to help these students to succeed. And I started to realize that the education system wasn't that evidence-based, and that the knowledge we have about personal fitness was at a higher caliber than the knowledge we have about education. And the knowledge we have about personal fitness isn't that high either. So I started taking online courses and going back to school and doing a lot of research. And I became sort of all of a sudden obsessed with education research because I wanted to know how to best help my students, and specifically with the goal of equity in mind, because if we're not offering disadvantaged students in disadvantaged communities the best education, how are we going to bridge the gap in some of these communities where there is an achievement gap that is a result of racism? And Robert and I, at around this time, became really close friends. And we were talking on the phone. He moved away from the community shortly after, but we became close friends, and we started talking like all the time. I'd call him at least once a week to talk about education. And then I was like, and I was also really into podcasts at the time. I was like, hey, like, do you want to start a podcast and just start recording our conversations and then, like, you know, upload them on the internet and see if people will listen to them? And lo and behold, there was an audience for that. And then this process led me to become super interested in statistical research, because, you know, a lot of figuring out the research behind teaching is deciding like what are the best strategies, and a lot of how you do that on a scientific level is through statistics. So to like research this and talk about it, I had to gain more knowledge, and now I've kind of reached this point where like I probably spend a couple hours on statistics research a week and in education, and like I'm doing my own meta-analysis now, and I just wrote a book about it, which is super weird because it's the nerdiest subject ever. Like my high school version of myself would have wanted to beat me up, but you know, and like I don't know, it's just this weird journey I've gone on, and like now I'm starting to get into the science of other topics. So I've actually got 3 blogs on the go randomly, all statistics focused. You know, you never tell you, if I could go back to high school and tell my like guitar playing, skateboarding self, like I was going to grow up and spend, you know, most of my free time researching and reading about statistics, I would have thought I was crazy. But here I am, and now I'm talking on your show about that journey. And yeah, I'm going to finish my introduction there. That's
amazing. I would definitely like to unpack 2 points here. One is evidence-based teaching. What exactly is that, and what did you discover that wasn't evidence-based? And then the other part is equity and race, and just why those 2 things either are interconnected, cause or effect. Let's talk about, yeah, those 2 points.
you know what? I'm really passionate about both these subjects, but I feel like Robert is more qualified to speak on one of them, if that's okay.
I wouldn't say that. I understand why you say that, but I feel like part of our journey has been about sharing our qualifications. So anything that I feel like we've talked in depth about, I think that you share in that wealth of that understanding and that experience. So I'll start first, just to
I just want to say I'm honored by that statement, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I think it's well deserved. So what I would say is that when we talk about evidence-based, and this is something we really focused on hammering out very specifically before we started. If there was anything that I could slow Joseph down because he just wanted to explode into the podcast, it was trying to get our hands around the idea of what does evidence-based mean. And really, I think the simplest way that I could explain it to our viewers when we had a podcast was there's a practical element and a logical element. The logical element is nothing can be said with an absolute certainty. If you understand that, you're already starting at a good place. And if you start with the attitude that everything should be questioned, every assertion should be questioned, you're starting at a good place. But what we can base our actions on and our behavior on is things that have been proven with evidence. And we would define evidence as things that have reached a certain level of rigor in terms of experimentation. And when you can't actually form an experiment, then when you can collect enough data points over a long enough period of time to see patterns. And those patterns can be looked at to a certain level of statistical significance, and then you can act on that. It doesn't mean that we understand the whole picture. It doesn't mean that we're not going to be wrong. We're probably guaranteed to be wrong. But our actions will be based on at least some level of certainty in if we do A, it will result in B. Hopefully the best is causation. Sometimes it's correlation, but acting on the best evidence available is the whole idea of evidence-based. Now, the practical element is really the most important part. You don't have to bury your head in statistics in order to be an evidence-based teacher. All you have to do is understand what evidence looks like to stay somewhat informed about what strategies, methods, understandings of learning itself, and the function of the brain and human behavior, just understanding what out there is, it has been proven by evidence, and then apply those things in your class, work on the execution of them, because execution is just as important as understanding which tool is the best. And then understanding that within your classroom, you can run your own tests. You just need to collect enough data within your own classroom. So getting to the point where you can behave in a certain way, make certain decisions, reflect on those decisions by evaluating data from your own class, and then based on that reflection and data and those observations, making new actions. That's the practical thing. When a teacher can do that, the sky really becomes the limit. And that's what really excited us when we wanted to start our podcast. We really wanted to get not necessarily teachers that just want to crunch all the numbers, but teachers that want to get into their class every week, every month, and look at the data they're collecting and then make new decisions based on that and see the growth over time.
Can I add to that?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm so passionate about both these topics, and I have so much I want to say about both. But I thought it might be cool if I just add before we jump into the equity piece rather than address them both at the same time.
Right.
But first, I want to say this is like a topic I love talking about. And I think our audience on our podcast hates, because I've done like multiple podcasts on this. And for whatever reason, the numbers always go down on our listens when we get to this topic. But I think, I kind of see myself as a science journalist in a way. And I think the media does a terrible job on reporting on science in all topics, because everyone has heard a parent or a loved one or a friend say like, this one study says eggs are good for you. This one study says eggs are bad. I don't know. Or you hear people being like, I hear fats are bad, or I hear carbs are bad. And you see the same thing happen in education. It's just because the media reports like every study as if they're in isolation or in some kind of science vacuum, and as if every new study is now the correct answer. So whenever a new study comes out that's popular, it gets reported on, and the results get reported as if that's now objective evidence and truth. But the problem is that like, that's not how a scientist thinks or a researcher thinks. When we look at studies, we're supposed to look at them, how they compare to other studies. So if, 8 studies come out saying eggs are good and 2 studies come out saying eggs are bad, you wouldn't say just because the last 2 said eggs are bad, that eggs are bad for you. And it works the same way in education. We have studies that come out saying inquiry-based learning is good, and we have studies that come out saying inquiry-based learning is bad. And you have to kind of look at what do most of those studies say. And we have a specific type of research for this, and it's called meta-analysis. And really qualified researchers use meta-analysis to make evidence-based decisions. And we can even look at things in terms of magnitude. Most teaching studies show a positive result. And that's because people don't publish studies with a bad result. So you have to kind of look at, well, what is the average result of a teaching study? And that almost becomes like a placebo, because like, when you have a study, it's almost always positive, in part because there's a plan, there's a structure, there's someone helping them, giving them instructional strategies and ideas, versus another teacher who's doing a random thing that they've just always done. And it's almost always doesn't outperform. So we can then take a look at, well, what is the average impact of these teaching interventions, and then make some decisions about what's best, because there's hundreds of teaching strategies out there. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing all these researchers on our podcast too. And every researcher always tells me their idea is the best. And some of them are so brilliant, and I love them all actually. But at the same time, everybody's idea is not the best. Somebody's wrong. And we have research that's used to determine who's right and who's wrong. And you know what? Sometimes I think that research is going to be wrong. If you're using statistics to make decisions, it's going to be wrong. But it's sure the heck better than everybody just making a random decision based on their gut, which is, I think, what we're trained to do. Just go with your gut, go what your feelings tell you to do. And I feel like our students deserve more. I feel like we should be making our best guessed evidence based off the best available research we have to us now. And research changes and evolves over time. And sometimes if you dive deeper into the research, you'll notice that like, oh, when we structure a study this way, this is the best result. And we structure a study this way, this is the best result. And that tells us really valuable information. We can dive deep into that. And I think that's also helpful. But it's rarely just that, we have to just go with the latest study. And I think that's a real problem with how education is reported on in the media in general.
Right. I would add to that. That was part of our frustration going into the research for the podcast, and even over time, we were somewhat frustrated by the attitude within our profession that this is an art, that teaching is just something that you just know how to do. You develop it over time by listening to your gut. And I mean, when it comes to building rapport with students, that's extremely important. And yes, that is sort of something you get from interaction. You get it from performing it and gaining that kind of gut feeling around building those relationships. But the actual act of teaching is more of a science. And when you look at it as a science, you get better results. So one of the things that we were really leaning on when we first built the podcast was if we can just push our profession ever so slightly
Mhm.
towards being more of a structured practice, like engineering or medicine, where there's all of these ideas about how to do something so noble, to heal somebody or to teach somebody. But if we just evaluate which practices are best most of the time, and then make a standard practice, like a standard practice of care, then we would have way better results in education. But that seems to be still such a foreign idea in our profession. And we, me and Joseph, recognize that most of the people within our profession and even in the hierarchy of a profession, they're coming from like language arts backgrounds. So the idea of thinking like a scientist is not always natural to them. So that was really our mission. If we can just push some of the thinking a little bit more scientific. We're not saying think of your students like input and output sheets. These are not balance sheets. We're not asking you to do that. We're just saying, look at your methods a little bit more scientifically and apply them a little bit more consistently, and make those little improvements over time. The health industry, which I studied when I was in my undergrad, it didn't become the success that it was overnight. It actually took decades of drumming out, how do I characterize it without being pejorative? Let's just say pseudo ideas and fad logic. The latest idea always seems like the newest, shiniest idea. And because there's no evidence, it's hard to dispute with them sometimes.
Yeah.
But once you get the understanding that there is no evidence, therefore it's not proven, then you wouldn't have to dispute with them. Just to add that too.
No, and I think there's the trap is like, as a practitioner of, education and as a teacher, like you see all these fads coming in. And I actually think some of them are fantastic and phenomenal. I think there's a huge push for equity right now in education, and I love that.
Yeah.
But I also feel like the evolution of education feels random. Like it doesn't feel like it's being driven by science. It feels like it's being driven by philosophy. So you get like really good ideas and really bad ideas coming down the pipeline at the exact same time. And you kind of feel like this weirdo because you're like, this dinosaur who's defending some practices of old that are evidence-based and are practical. And at the same time, like the teachers who endorse this, so like super pro on some of the new ideas too. And it's just like, I just want the good ideas. It's not about new versus old. It's about good versus bad. But
and I don't know if we haven't got to the next part of this yet, but I just want to add one more thing if I can. I would be remiss if we didn't mention that there is a political element to this that often the hard sciences don't have to deal with as much, maybe at the very top, but throughout the entire, stratification of the teaching profession, there is a political element to that, from the resources that are in a classroom to the practices and policies that come into favor or out of favor, depending on which political party is in control of the education department. So there's that element. And so that's why we were not under the delusion that bringing a little bit more evidence-based practices into the mainstream was going to be an easy thing, or changing the needle, even budging the needle on that was not going to be a difficult thing. We understood that there are constraints on our profession that are not on other professions, that have really found results through applying scientific logic and evidence-based practices. But still, we don't think it's an impossibility. And that's really what motivated us through the whole evolution of our business, let alone our podcast.
Yeah, and it's funny because there is an association of left versus right with pedagogical ideas, and in my mind, like, liberalism and conservatism have nothing to do with education, or should not have anything to do with education. I hate the idea that one political party is attached to like one pedagogical idea. And the reality is there are good pedagogical ideas that are associated with conservative logic, and there are good pedagogical ideas that are associated with liberal logic. And that's just a strange reality of how our education system has been carved out in the modern era.
Absolutely.
So maybe we should talk about equity. Oh, sorry.
Yes, please do.
All right, Robert, you definitely go first.
Okay, so I brought my story up to the point where, give me 1 second.
This is the problem with recording live. There's always going to be a problem, right?
Yeah, that's totally okay.
Okay.
This is, oh, sorry, go.
Sorry. So I brought my story up to the point where I met Joseph, and Joseph kind of told his part about how we mate. But I think this equity element to what we do really got fired up when we met. And I should bring back the story a little bit. When I talk about identity and trying to get that whole sense of my identity, there was something that I was told when I was very young, as I'm separated from my family because my dad was American. So all of my dad's side of the family were all in the United States. My mom's side of the family, most of them were in Jamaica. And so our little nuclear family was in Canada, and I felt, very disconnected. I had my own sense of who I was, but I longed for that kind of community that I was looking for. And I think somewhere in my very adolescent mind, I clung onto this idea that my ancestors are some people way back in my history that I had to connect with. So when I finally made the decision of becoming a teacher, I jumped on the chance to have my education in Lakehead University because I heard that it was a great Aboriginal studies university. And I have Aboriginal ancestors, and I wanted a chance, since I couldn't connect with them being in the United States, I want to have a chance to try to learn more about the indigenous culture of Canada. And when I went there, it was a very heralding experience because not only was I met with some prejudice towards, African Canadian, I was met with a ton of prejudice towards Indigenous people in Thunder Bay. It seems to be a particular issue in that city. That's not to say that that's the views of everybody, but I feel like there's an interesting dynamic between Indigenous people in Thunder Bay and the English and French Canadian culture in that city. So I think that shaped my idea that I could not learn from an institution what I was trying to learn about myself.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I get this call out of nowhere, did not send out any resumes yet. I get a call from a First Nations reserve saying, do you want to interview with us? And I'm like, sure, but how'd you get my number, kind of thing. And they said that I must have signed something during a job fair that I didn't even remember attending. And they got my contact information there. And so I did an interview, and the next thing I know, I'm being flown out to what at first I thought was going to be somewhere in Northern Ontario. It ended up being in Northern Quebec. So when I got my plane tickets, I was extremely shocked to see that I was going to Montreal and going to Northern Quebec. And I thought maybe this is a mistake, but I'm just going to go with it. So I ended up in Quebec, which was very strange. I didn't have enough things with me. I had not a dime in my pocket. All of my credit cards are maxed out. They flew me there and they paid for all my accommodations. And when I landed in OJ and met, I should say that the community was called OJ Bugamu, which we would call OJ. I met Joseph here. And it was like, I think I was just so exhausted from the journey getting there that I just kind of opened up in a way that I don't normally open up with people. And we had a very deep conversation where I expressed my ideas, which were very raw now from my experience in Thunder Bay, that I felt like higher education was not an institution designed to help someone that is marginalized, to build their communities into successful communities based on their culture. What it's going to do at best is it's going to take people from this very rural community, make them very highly educated. That would be the great goal. And then they will be separated from that community. It'll be very difficult for them to bring back that human capital to their community, and they'll probably end up down south. So I expressed my beliefs that I felt like in many ways, the education system was completing the original purpose of assimilation. And if I can speak for Joseph here, he was really shocked by that idea, thought I was extremely radical. He's like, I thought I was
radical. Call you radical.
You called me radical. You're like, I thought I was radical, but that's really radical. And he expressed the views that he felt like that education was something, that his experience in university was completely different. And education was something so special and gave people the opportunity to really shape their communities. And we had this really interesting conversation that I think was really the forge that began what would eventually become our partnership, and in terms of the business, in terms of the podcast. And it all started with this sort of idea of how does education play into identity? And I think along our journeys, especially considering what's been happening in the world in the last 2 years, it's always been happening, but it's been televised in a very visceral way. I feel like both of our opinions have kind of slowly come towards each other. Like, I'm more open to what the future could hold for institutionalized education and what the Ontario education system can become. I'm a lot more hopeful than I was 7 years ago. And I'm not going to try to speak for you, but I'm just going to give my impression of some of our conversations. I feel like Joseph has probably seen a lot of things recently that made him question this system at its core, not just the elements that we've always talked about, the elements of discrimination when we go into labeling theory and Pygmalion theory, and when we look at residential schools, and when we look at how the system treats marginalized communities, but just even at its core, there might be some problematic elements. But I'll let
Joseph. I think when I first met Robert, my life was very sheltered. And I'd actually just come from abroad. I've been teaching abroad for 2 years. I taught in a school in Korea, and then I taught in a school for behavioral students in the UK, which was also a really cool experience. But, you know, I hadn't really had a lot of firsthand experience with racism, with the exception being some relatives of mine who had some unsavory reviews. And Thunder Bay, I also noticed that Thunder Bay had an issue with racism towards Indigenous people. But, you know, once you're plugged into a school of all minority students, surrounded by, and a community that's on the outside of it, that's all settler people or white people, for lack of a better term, you really got to see that racism. And then, you know, Robert here has actually become one of my closest friends. and I've gotten to see some of his experience in life, and he's had to deal with racism in his life as a non-white person. Really opened my mind, and at the same time this was happening, Black Lives Matter was a really big movement. I was researching the residential schools because I was teaching in a school and I wanted to cover that history. And I was spending a lot of my time researching histories of atrocities in Canada. And it was just this weird thing, having your eyes opened, in a certain way for the first time. But I think for me, Robert, I think sees a lot of this on the institutional level. And I think I see this a little bit more on the individual level, not to sort of use that there's a couple bad apples argument. That's not what I'm saying. But I think racism and discrimination is really insidious because people don't know they're racist. I think the average person, and this is not to throw the average person, but the average person has unconscious bias. And I don't think they're aware of it. In fact, I would go further in that to say that the vast majority of people have unconscious bias. And you see examples of it. I'll never forget an individual who was speaking. They were a teacher in a previous school board. And they were speaking to the head of the Cree School Board while I was working there. And that person had just finished talking about residential schools. And he had just finished explaining that he had been told, he had his language beaten out of him, essentially. And that was why he wanted to be the leader of the school board, because he wanted to help Indigenous students to learn their own language and experience their own culture in school. And then a teacher who had just graduated Teachers College yesterday, and they were a lovely person. They really, I don't think they even were aware of the problem of their statement, said, I don't think we should be teaching your language in the school because it makes it harder for the students to learn English. And I was like, oh God, that's a really awkward moment.
Yeah.
But I think they were actually a super nice person. And I think that mistake is just, it highlights the overall problem. If people are unaware of their privilege and they're unaware of their bias, it makes dealing with racism much harder, because it's sort of like Alcoholics Anonymous. In order for you to admit or to deal with your problem, first you have to admit you have a problem. Well, if your entire society has a problem, it's really hard to deal with. And you can't no one changes positively by you just yelling at them, you're a racist. I've never found that to be productive. And yet we have to get people to realize that almost all of us are part of the problem. I'm sure myself included. And not to try and say I'm a racist person, but I'm sure I've had moments of unconscious bias. And I think that's a really, really challenging problem to deal with. And I don't even know if an institutional answer is the answer, because the problem is so insidious and so powerful that I don't really know the full answer to solving that, to be honest. But other than trying to focus on your own little part of the world and trying to do the best you can with individuals and expose people to alternative points of view. And for me, that's been about education, but I'm sure that's about something else for different people. And I see we have 30 seconds left at best.
Before we get cut off, I've just sent a second link to your Facebook message so we can continue the conversation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'll end this so it can just download the recording.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. We're back to Human Chapters. This is part 2 of our conversation with Robert and Joseph, and their chapter is A Journey in Education. We have covered equity and evidence-aligned or evidence-based practice so far in part 1. Okay, let's continue with the conversation. We were still on equity and talking about the average person, the unconscious bias.
Right. Let me just add something to what Joseph was saying. And I feel like that's what makes platforms like this so important, Human Chapters, because I think people learn better from hearing other people's stories. So what Joseph was saying was that if you point at someone and yell in their face and say that you're a racist, they're just going to shut down. And often, just like I was searching for a community, and that led me to be a teacher and then an evidence-based teacher, and then really finding self-actualization.
Yeah.
Everybody's looking for that same thing. And if they get too many finger wags with just labels like racist without anyone really connecting with them, they will find a community that will embrace their beliefs the way they are. So platforms like this are really, really important, just to expose other people to others' experiences and give them that depth, because there are communities that it didn't even register until I visited other communities that were completely homogeneous. There really wasn't a depth of experience there. Everyone shared this very predictable at times experience. And a lot of them are craving something new. They're craving a way to have more experience. But if they come into a new environment and that new environment is just initially abrasive to all of their beliefs without this idea of let's connect, let's come together and reason together on our ideas, they will go back and they will share this attitude that we have to protect the ideas that were introduced to us from the very beginning, in not a progressive type way, but in a very like an asylum.
Yeah.
So I would say just connecting that piece about how important it is to look at the equity piece and the evidence piece is what we saw together as teachers, really just trying to connect with students. We realized in trying to connect with students and trying to educate them, we realized just how much equity impacted their ability to be a part of the learning process. I really felt like when I went to the community, I used to tell my students, within these four walls, this is our domain. This is a learning community. All of the ideas, all of the pressures, all of what society says about who you are don't matter once you enter this building. When you enter this building, we are here to shape our minds and our attitudes and have courageous conversations. So I told them that these four walls are sacred.
Yeah.
If there's something that's burdening you outside of these four walls, bring it in, share it, let the entire group bear it, and then give each other that space, that grace to grow. And I really thought those lofty ideas would be enough, until I realized just how, I don't want to say insurmountable, but just how monumental, particularly for indigenous populations or indigenous communities, their experience with education itself, how profound that was. In fact, it didn't really dawn on me. And I guess it's just like me to say a week into my teaching is a long time, but it felt like a long time. So a week into my first assignment in the Cree community, which was my first teaching assignment completely. Yeah. We had parents' night, and I had a parent that I talked to on the phone, and we had a great discussion. They were so motivated and so excited about what was going on in the class, and they wanted to come in to see me. So they came in, and I waited extra late because they couldn't make it on time. And when they approached my room, they stopped at the door and froze. And when I first saw that, because of all my experience with this person over the phone and some of my life experience, my first interpretation was, oh no, we had this great connection over the phone, but they didn't know that I was Black. It's happened to me so many times in my life. So when I saw that, it looked so familiar. that I assumed that that's what it was, and I was disappointed. But I still wanted to make a connection with that person because it was the student that was important to me. So I said, "Hi, how are you?" And they didn't say anything. So I walked out into the hallway very calmly and gave a lot of space. And I said, let's talk about the student. And then we began to have a discourse. And it warmed up over time. And then we were laughing again and having this great experience. And it seemed like it was just what we had over the phone. And I was like, great, okay, we're past that. I can do what I need to do. Yeah. And as they were turning to walk away, they stopped and turned back and they asked me, "Do you know why I froze when I came to your door?" And my heart kind of sunk because I was like, oh, I don't really want to go back to that experience. But in my mind, I was like, I could guess, but I'm not going to. And I said, no, why? And she said, I looked at your classroom and the way the desks are in those very neat, perfect rows. And it reminded me of residential school. And I would say that is one of those page tearing moments in my life where there was the educator before that moment and the educator after. Yeah. I really realized that the institution itself, its look, its smell, the way we do about what we do, the things that we associate with what a teacher looks like and how a teacher talks, all these things were so intensely triggering for this particular communities, these particular communities. And I thought to myself, all in that moment, this dichotomy of the Cree community is desperate at times, I would say, to create an education system that looks and feels just like what we have down south. Because if they had something different, I feel like we would label it something other than school. They need to have the image of higher education, and in Canada it only looks one way. But at the same time, it's like this double-edged sword where their community in particular has been offended by this institution. And now I'm an agent of this institution. And all of what I'm trying to do in my classroom, I'm doing it in the very, I don't know. I don't even know how to express it. I'm like in the regalia of something that has caused so much pain. And a lot of these kids, their grandparents are the ones that may be taking care of them at various times in their lives. And the grandparents will be the parent guardians that you're dealing with. And many of their grandparents experience residential schools. Now, there's different experiences that many of them had, so I can never assume that they had an experience that was particularly traumatic. But also at the same time, I couldn't assume in the opposite direction. So it was this thing that really put me in a dilemma that I feel like I never actually recovered from. It put me in this dilemma to understand that, one person or a couple of people or even one community can't thread those needles and draw, if I can make an image of drawing the sutures of these wounds by themselves. That actually it's going to take the coming together of multiple communities at multiple layers. And this is something that is not going to be able to be done by teachers alone or doctors or politicians. And that's what makes, again, platforms like this so important for all of those professionals, for all those people from walks of life to be able to hear those experiences and say, wait a minute, okay, I'm doing something similar in my profession. And now I can connect with you. Maybe this is something we can do together.
Can I expand on that a little?
Yes.
So because I was concerned because we've been talking about residential schools quite a bit already, and I know you're from New Zealand, and I'm guessing your audience is pretty international, so I wasn't sure how much your audience would know about this.
Going to ask what residential schools are.
So Canada has originally was an indigenous population. It was colonized by mostly Europeans, especially the British, and they got it. They decided that they wanted to assimilate the indigenous population. So they partnered with different churches, especially the Catholic Church, to create these boarding schools. And then they systematically placed these boarding schools actually very far from the home communities to separate the parents and the kids. And then they forced all the kids of the indigenous populations to go to these schools, literally at gunpoint. They had our police force came and kidnapped the children. And like I have a friend who he went and lived in the bush off the land to avoid getting captured by the police, and he succeeded. But his entire childhood was spent at a cabin in the woods, hiding from the police. And at these schools, there were a lot of problems because there wasn't a lot of supervision, and some of the teachers weren't qualified. They ended up hiring convicted pedophiles, so there was widespread sexual abuse of children. At least 30% of students would have been molested, because we know that 30% of all students got settlements for being sexually molested in these schools. But then you think, how many kids actually, or how many people actually want to admit their abuse in court? So I would imagine it's much higher than 30%. And then we know that the death toll was really, really high because they didn't feed these children often. The government actually ended up doing scientific experiments on them, which is super messed up. One school, they fed the kids only vitamins to see what would happen, no actual food. And some of the death toll estimates have been as high as 50%. Officially, the government estimate is 5%. But right now, our country is excavating these schools, which only closed in the 90s. And they're finding mass graves and of amassed unmarked graves, similar to what you'd see in any genocide. And they're all children's bodies. And we've actually known these mass graves existed for decades now because the government wrote about it. In fact, the government wrote down in a policy document to stop counting the bodies because they were worried that The Hague was going to prosecute government officials for all the children that were dying. And we know some of these children might have been beaten to death. We know some of them might have been just murdered. Some of them might have committed suicide. We know that the health conditions inside these schools were incredibly bad. And some of these kids just died of disease. But even if the government estimates are correct, which I'm assuming they're not, because they purposely obviously have an intention to lower their estimates here. Imagine 5%. My entire childhood, I didn't know a single kid that died. So 5 out of 100 is the government's estimate. And we know that in certain decades, even the government admits it was probably about 50%. So then, you work in a school like this, and all the grandparents in the school literally went to residential schools, and some of the parents did. And you realize that there is this huge trauma inflicted by the education system of our country on these people. And some of these parents are still angry at teachers. And then you're all outsiders. And then there's issues of racism between white people and indigenous people still. Yeah. So that creates this us versus them tension in the community between the mostly white teachers and the non-white community or village. And then you also have other factors, like a lot of the people in this area were actually living off the land still in a traditional way up until the 90s. In fact, the community was founded in 1989. So most of the people in that area that we lived in were actually living off the land in the 80s. And I have friends who were still living off the land in the 90s before they joined the community. So participation in capitalism as we see it today is a new thing. So your whole experience as a teacher is very strange. And then you also have to realize that these schools were beating children for speaking their own language, for talking about their culture, for talking about their history. And this created this shame And most people aren't willing to talk about it. I had a friend who was an elder in the community, and she told me her story personally, and it was incredibly devastating. And I asked her to share it with my students who are learning about residential schools, because most of them, their own parents weren't willing to share their stories because it was too traumatic for them to share with their children.
Sure.
And she would not share it because she was too traumatized to share it with the class. And I think you just sort of see this internalized oppression. You know, I used to have students saying like, I can't learn, I'm Indian, or I can't learn, I'm Native, or you're not really supposed to teach us here. This isn't a real school. And so you're really dealing with an incredibly challenging situation. I think so much of it goes back to these residential schools, which is this historical trauma that's really passed down from generation to generation. And it's only 1996 that the last one of these schools was closed. So, sorry, pretty heavy.
Wow. But it's so important. That's the thing with history. It's so important to know what came before this point and what's led to the complexities and the depth of difficulties and connections for everyone involved. And if we're thinking education, then, even the statement, education as a human right, that in itself is quite flawed. And this is probably a perfect example. That's one country. How many other countries have faced similar and experienced similar residential schools and scenarios being played out?
Yeah, I would say that Canada has benefited from an image that is quite benevolent. They have, we all know as Canadians, we get this very benevolent image, and I don't want to paint Canada with an extremely broad brush, but as it pertains to the indigenous communities, we were particularly ruthless. And I say we because if you grow up in Canada, if you benefit from the economy of Canada, if you benefit from the experience of growing up in Canada, then you are a stakeholder in those Cree communities, in those indigenous communities, just as much as anyone else. If it's, as we get older, we become in charge of the policies, or at least we have representatives that are. So we can't pretend that this is something that either happened in a different time or happened in a different place and that we are not responsible for it. I think all of us, we are responsible for it as Canadians, or at least responsible for making the changes that are necessary now. And I would say that my heart really went out to the Cree community that I worked in, because as a person that experienced a lot of discrimination in my life, a particularly specialized kind of discrimination, I would say, is placed upon the Black community. And I recognized some of the most devastating elements of the Black experience within the Cree experience, particularly colorism, which is something that we generally, people within marginalized communities generally don't talk about outside of their own community, because it's such a complex thing. Racism is Black and white, right? Or racism is this community against that community, but colorism is the reflection of the notions of the dominant culture reverberating through these marginalized cultures, and they're often so devastating. So you would go on reserve, and there is some parts of the identity of being indigenous that is so embraced. There's a pride to living off the land. But then there's also this dichotomy between students that have lighter skin and straighter hair and what are considered to be more Western features are going to get different treatment, often better treatment. And the kids recognize this. And at the same time, if you have more indigenous features and features that are considered to be indigenous, darker skin, you're also going to get sometimes a poor treatment based on that alone. And I recognize that from my community, particularly if you're talking about Caribbean community, because my mom is from Jamaica. Colorism is extremely strong there, being a British colony. I saw that amongst them. And it was devastating when you had kids hurling insults. One of the worst things you could say to a kid is to call them a black kid in a Cree community. And I'm their teacher. And they'd be like, they would show me so much respect. But then when they would want to demonstrate disrespect to each other, they would call each other black. And so I had to have a sit down with my students one time. And there was two students in particular. One was considered the lightest skin, and they would ostracize her for being very light skinned. And they would call her white. And there was another student that was looked down upon by his peers. And often it revolved around him being much darker. And I had to sit those two students down, and I took two pieces of paper. One was a black construction paper and one was a white piece of paper. And I asked them, what did you say? And they both put their head down, and one says, I called her a white girl. And I said, why'd you do that? And he says, because she was mean to me. And so I turned to the other one. I was like, what did you call him? And he says, I called him a black kid. I said, why'd you say that? So, because he was mean to me. But I said, why is calling him a black kid an insult? And she said, I don't know. And I said, well, I'm black. Is it bad that I'm black? And she's like, no, it's not. I'm like, so why is it an insult? And she said she didn't know. And I could see that genuine look in her eye that she really didn't even know why this was a slur, like why this was something that was considered the most offensive thing you can say. So I took those two pieces of paper and I laid the paper against my skin. And I said, what color is this piece of paper? She said, it's black. And I said, what color is my skin? And she said, it's brown. And I said, okay, what color is your skin? And she said, it's lighter brown. And I said, what color is his skin? And she said, it's brown too. I said, if we're all brown, why are we fighting over skin color? And they didn't know. And I took the white piece of paper and I said, let's put our hands on this piece of paper. And I said, whose skin looks like this white piece of paper? And they said, none. So I said, who's white here? And they said, none. And then I even referenced Joseph here. And I said, you guys all know Joseph. I referred to him by his teacher name though. And they're like, yeah. And I was like, does his skin look like this piece of paper? I said, no. So why is he white? And they said, I don't know. And I said, you want me to tell you the truth? They said, yeah. And I said, I don't know either. I don't know why I'm black. And I don't know why Mr. Joseph is white. But it's not something that we need to create a division about. Because you can see we are neither white nor black. Yeah. We are all brown. We are all the color that you see in nature. And they both looked at each other with this sense of relief because I could see that it weighed on them so heavily. But one student was afraid to be black and the other one was afraid to be white because what it meant in their minds was other. That's all it meant. And that's how it starts. They had this idea that in societies, there's always other, and you don't want to be other. And I realized that when I taught those two students that, even though I didn't give them an answer to the dilemma, I just clarified some of the reality of it. And I showed them that adults haven't figured this out either. I realized when they walked away, that might have been the most important thing I taught them that year. Even though one of the students raised many levels in reading ability and other students were raising very well in their math ability, I realized that that identity issue would follow them for the rest of their life. And if they didn't get some information, something to grasp on at a young enough age to scaffold throughout their experiences, it could end up being a much larger issue than whether their grade 4 teacher taught them about Christopher Columbus or taught them about what's the capital of Ontario. So yeah.
My next question is your podcast and the name of your podcast and why. What got you guys to call it that? Well,
Robert actually named it. By the way, I just want to say, Robert, you're such a great storyteller.
Yes.
I love listening to Robert tell stories. It's got just that knack.
I appreciate that.
Gravitas and that slow speaking, he just pauses in all the right spots. Actually, I think the internet connection froze at the most dramatic point in your story, and I was like, but I think I was talking about that equity piece earlier. I don't know about Robert, but for me, I found that really hard to talk about, actually, in part because we're supposed to be talking about those things, and that's supposed to be the reality. But I actually feel like there's a stigma because if everybody has unconscious bias, nobody wants to talk about it. And it's the same thing with the education pedagogy. Everyone wants to say they're evidence-based, but nobody wants to take a real deep critical look at the literature and challenge their own pedagogical practices to ask the question is if they're really evidence-based. And even professors, who I've interviewed, they have a hard time admitting when the evidence doesn't support what they say, because nobody likes being wrong. And there's the whole topic of our podcast is this really uncomfortable topic, actually. And I think I've been more open on this interview than I've ever been before, which is kind of scary to me, to be honest. And I think that's where Robert came up with the idea of pedagogy non grata. It's just this, it feels like this secret, it feels like this thing you feel like you have to talk about because you really want to improve the state of education. Both Robert and I are really passionate about this, and we care about the future of our field. But at the same time, it's an uncomfortable conversation. And I think our name reflects that.
Yeah, just to add to that, Joseph called me, and I was actually, ironically, I guess this would be the perfect scene in a movie. I'm at a bus stop, and I was really contemplating what I wanted to do, because I always envisioned myself leaving the public institution and trying to do something outside of it, because I felt it was too confining. And I still had this dilemma of whether the institution itself could be buttressed or changed in a way that it could accomplish what it needs to accomplish for marginalized communities. And he calls me up, and I'm at the bus stop, and he says, do you want to talk about this stuff and record it as a podcast? And I thought, why would anyone want to listen to this? Do you really think there's an audience for us to just gab about the most nerdiest aspects of teaching. And once I got past that bit, I started to get scared. There was a dread there because I thought, wait a minute, what we're going to talk about, if we're really going to talk, there is liability here. It's going to be difficult to have the conversations that would really be important to have. And we already felt like some of what we were trying to do in our own profession was often met with some reservation, to put it lightly. Particularly the idea that teaching could be in any way scientific. It seemed utterly offensive to many teaching professionals. And bringing up numbers, quantifying things, just seemed so offensive to many of our colleagues. And I said, I don't think what we're talking about will be received. It won't be welcomed. And as I'm thinking of that, that's when, persona non grata came into my mind. And I thought, okay, persona non grata, that's great. But I wanted to say something about teaching. And that's when I put pedagogy non grata in it. And I had to sell Joseph on it because it is I would admit, it is not the easiest thing to roll off the tongue, or a lot of people don't know that pedagogy is associated with education. So, but I was really stuck on that. And I'm glad that we came to a consensus on that name. And that's kind of how that name came to be.
That's such an incredible story, because I know when I first came across it, and it's only been since 2020 where I've done a lot of learning. The journey started in 2019, actually. But then 2020 and this year is when I did have come across a number of podcasts, and listening to yours in particular, and really challenging the ideas of what's being pushed forward, but why is it being pushed forward, and is it the best for everyone? That's what I've taken personally from it, and sort of the open dialogue, which has been incredible. So thank you very much for that. And I know we have just a few minutes remaining, but if we do go over, I've got another link there, which this conversation is absolutely fascinating and so vital to unpack. But what I did want to ask is, through the podcast, or even through your teaching journey, what are some of the practices that have changed or transformed you guys as educators, first as individuals, but then in connection with your kids?
You know what? For me, like, everything has changed, and it's always evolving now. And I think that's part of being an evidence-based practitioner, is just realizing that your understanding is only based off the evidence you have now. So actually, I'm planning to do a podcast episode in the near future about going over everything I've ever said on the podcast that I thought was wrong. Just doing like one big long episode, because there's things I know I said that I read future evidence on. I was like, no, I was wrong on that. And I don't even feel like I'm the same person as the person who entered into OJ. I don't think the same person left, or it was the person who came in. Just because I am a very privileged person, and I still am, but like, I wasn't even aware of that, really. I thought I was. I considered myself a very open-minded left-wing person. I took women's studies in university, and minority studies and history, and I mostly studied social history, and I thought like, here I am as this woke person, and I don't think I was. And that's been a big part. It's just understanding my privilege in my classroom, and trying to focus on equity. But in terms of instruction, I left university thinking I was going to be all about inquiry-based learning, and I thought balanced literacy was awesome, and I thought guided reading was the key to success for students, and I thought I was going to do game-based learning all the time. And looking at the literature and researching education, I've had to admit I was wrong on every single part of that. And I'm still learning things, I've recently just been learning a lot about morphology instruction and linguistic phonics instruction. And then I had to, I interviewed two people very knowledgeable about it on the podcast. And then I went and looked at the research myself independently afterwards. And I had to sort of like bridge the gap between what these professors are saying, what the literature is showing. And it was an interesting thing because they were both so brilliant. They're two of the most brilliant professors I've ever interviewed. And yet they're saying very opposite things. So I had to, figure out what is my takeaway from this experience? So I think I'm just, I've become a student. Again, I am constantly learning and changing my own thoughts and practices. But I guess if I could say the number one practice I have has become encouraging my students to do peer tutoring, because I think it creates self-efficacy for them.
Yeah.
It makes them lifelong learners on their own so that they can learn without me, which is the ultimate goal.
Yes.
Robert, sorry, I went too long.
No, I would say that if you went through the experience that we went through the experience and didn't come out a different person, then you weren't actually there, right? You were phoning in it. You kind of shut down and you just kind of made your way through that experience, because that experience had so many twists and turns, it was such a stark environment compared to where I lived. And we both came out completely different people. And I feel like if I went back and taught in that community again, I would come out a different person again. I really think that that's, again, talking about this platform here, I really think that you can't actually make connections with people without becoming a different person. And that's not to say that you completely assimilate or you just absorb everything that of the value sets of wherever you go, because I don't think that's necessarily a good thing either. But humans are designed to communicate and imprint and build consensus. And when you're not doing that, then you're
Hi guys, it's Human Chapters again, and we are on part 3. So we have been discussing equity and Roberts and Joseph's podcast, Pedagogy Non Grata. They discussed how the name at what point the name was conceived and just the journey. And then the last question they've been answering is, as educators, what are some of the transformational practices that they have experienced?
Right. And I was just in the midst of saying that I feel like when we shut down, when we go into different environments and we're not making those connections, that the ability to make those connections is actually what makes us human. So it's like the definition of humanity. Like when you're operating in a space where you're shutting down and withdrawing and not making those connections, you're actively being less human. I don't know how else to explain that. But I would say out of all of the things that we've looked at that have had such a profound effect on us in terms of our practice and teaching and our connections with the students, I would say the catalyst of the evidence-based component really started when a new program rolled into our school. And it had, someone there that was going to counsel with us and offer their services. And I was interested. As a new teacher, I hadn't become jaded yet to the whole idea of new policies and new initiatives. So I was happy. What is this about? And I felt like a lot of the more seasoned professionals were like, well, these things come and go. So they weren't as excited about it, but I was interested. And there's one thing that the person that was there to facilitate this new initiative said that caught my attention, that really got me to give the program a chance. He said that our fundamental tenet is that all students, and he stopped on all, he said all students can learn at a high level. And that, it like hit me like a light bulb, because I felt like up until that point, there was something that was slightly being dimmed in my outlook towards the public system. And he hit it on the head. I felt like the longer I was there, the more I felt like through osmosis, there was this idea that we need to lower the standards for certain students and certain people. We need to, and out of equity, I felt like equity is this great thing, but it was also being used or weaponized to lower standards. And I feel like that's not what equity means. And it's not said in that way. It's really just in the, the byline. It's in between what people are saying. And it was creeping into my consciousness. And I felt it as negativity. But when he said that, it crystallized. Yes, that's different. If your program, if this is its fundamental tenet, that all students, regardless of whether they're neurotypical or neuroatypical, regardless if they come from this background or that background, regardless of what resources they have in their community, all students have the ability to learn at a high level. If that's what you're going to tell me and you're going to show me how to get there, then I will listen to anything you have to say. And I think that started that piece of the evidence-based journey for me. And I came out like a Parcelite or a prophet. I don't know how Joseph would characterize it. And I came to Joseph and I was, listen, they're talking about some interesting things. All of that extra flashy stuff and all the slideshows and all that might have looked, like a bunch of hubbub and jargon. But at the core, if this is what he's offering, if this is what this program's about, it's worth investigating.
Yeah.
And I broke it down into what I felt were like the 5 tenets of the program that they were offering. Not that they said that that's what they're offering, but what I felt like they were after. And I broke it down to Joseph. And I think that kind of started our idea of what a good education program looks like.
Yeah.
And even though I feel like, the natural current of politics and education and the work environment and the pressures of that community, took its toll on whether that program was going to be successful or not. What we learned from just the attempt is really the seed for everything we did after that.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. And I want to say I was a gym teacher at the time, and I wasn't invited to the training sessions. So then Robert came over to my house afterwards, and he started like prophesizing towards me, or apostatizing. I don't know if I'm using the right word, but it doesn't matter. He was like propagandizing me. He was indoctrinating me in RTI, and which is the program that was RTI. And I was just like sold. And one of the things that just hit me was the guy brought up meta-analysis in his pitch. And at that time, I was like all about reading meta-analysis to bench press more weight. And that was my life goal. And I was like, oh, it's science-based. And then I was like, you know what? Why aren't we using science in education? This is ridiculous. And to this day, I still think RTI is actually one of the absolute best education programs out there. And it doesn't focus on anything that most of the other programs fall on. It's not about like a specific teaching strategy. It's a framework, and it's about getting you to be data-based yourself. And like that, you were talking about things that we learned. I collect data about my own teaching all the time now, and that's become a big part of who I am as a teacher, and that's from RTI. It's, to me, that framework of how you approach teaching is more important than the individual strategies you're using, because it's more important that you find efficient ways to operate than it is that you are using this specific pedagogical strategy in my mind.
Yeah. And Joseph, for our listeners that are not aware of RTI, what is it?
So RTI is this really complex program. So I'm going to try and summarize it really quickly.
Yeah.
But it's the idea that you're working collaboratively with your school.
Yeah.
And as teachers, you use formative assessment and you set learning goals at the beginning of each unit and use formative assessment to track, are your students reaching those learning goals? And you then look at your formative assessment sheets each week with your fellow teachers, and you try and ask that question, are our students learning what we want them to learn?
Yeah.
And if they're not learning what you want them to learn, you're supposed to change your teaching methods. And that for me was the key. And so the next year, that year I was teaching gym, and the next year I started using this system. And I realized, no, my students were not learning what I wanted them to learn. Mm-hmm. And I was just teaching the way my teachers had always taught me. I was teaching English, and it wasn't working. So I started using RTI tracking, and I just started trying new ideas, looking at John Hattie's work. He's a really great researcher on what works. And my students started to learn better. And then I started to refine that over time. And this is something I'm still doing to this day. I've never stopped collecting data from that point. And that was 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And my teaching practice has just gotten better and better because I'm constantly refining it by looking at what works in my classroom and what doesn't. And I think it's entirely possible that there's methodologies as teachers we're naturally good at and methodologies we're naturally bad at, which probably gives me a bias towards the ones I'm good at using. But I don't think that matters as long as I'm getting results. And to me, that is what RTI is about. It's about turning you into an evidence-based practitioner. And it doesn't even have to be on the base. It doesn't even need the research actually, because as soon as you start being like, oh, this isn't working, I need to do something different, you're automatically going to become a better teacher over time, in my opinion. And I personally, I think that's the real genius to RTI. Although I think Robert would point towards the collaborative aspect to it, which I do think is important, admittedly.
Yeah, I would say that to me, the secret sauce to RTI was kind of really what I said before, that if you get together with your fellow teachers and you all say to yourself, these students are all capable of learning at a high level, and you start with that basis, it will keep you from doing the thing that I feel like really impacts students the most, particularly marginalized students or students that are not neurologically typical. And there is a tendency to lower standards. If you're not getting what you want from your students, you say, okay, it's too difficult, let's lower the standards. And it's not that you're not doing it maliciously. You're not doing it to have a bad outcome or a bad effect or a bad impact. But it's because you're doing it without even observing exactly what's happening. You could lower a little here, lower a little there, make this little change here, make this little change there. And then the learning becomes a little more comfortable and you think, okay, we're accomplishing something, but you don't realize over that 3-month process, you've brought down all of the standards and there is no way to get those students where they need to get to by the end of the year. And then those shortcomings will be compounded over that year and over the next and over the next. And so you have students entering grade 1, not reading at grade level, and they enter grade two and 3. And by the time they get to 3, then they're on IEPs. And now you have a legal document that says, let's lower all the standards for that student. So I say maybe because in different areas, an IEP is a legal document that modifies the whole curriculum for that student. Sometimes you can accommodate, sometimes you can modify. If you modify, you're actually teaching that student at a lower grade level. So it becomes, institutionalized now. And that legal document follows them all the way up to grade 8 in the Canadian system, and then it disappears. And they go to high school, and then they're on their own.
What's the grade level?
Well, it depends on what you're modifying, right? Because when you get to our high school is streamed, right? Our high school is streamed. So if you want that student to have access to university, they're not going to be able to modify certain things to have that student access university curriculum. So it's it's really, to me, an institutionalized way of saying, well, this student is not capable of learning at a high level. And that's what really weighed on me. And when I understood why that might sound like a good idea to have this document to accommodate and to help students. But when I saw just how many students were being given IEPs, these legal documents in grade 3, it was like I've been to schools where more than half of my students in my class had IEPs in grade 5, and they were modified down several grade levels. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? I don't understand what I'm observing here. So I feel like starting with a group of professionals with that tenet, all students can learn at a high level, and it's up to us to use observation and science-based or evidence-based practices to find the methods and practices that work for them. And then doing it as a group, because not every teacher can be as reflective, or not every teacher will be able to see when they're lowering standards, or we have ebbs and flows in when we feel good about what we're doing, or we feel over our head and give up. And when you're working collectively, you can see that giving up, and you have this group that's there to support you. And then I think exactly what Joseph said, that practice of learning to be an evidence-based teacher and observing and keeping data. And then after that, the other part of the secret sauce was, because you're setting all your learning goals all the way up from the endpoint. What do we want our students to know in grade 12? In our school, it went from kindergarten to grade 12. So if you're in school from kindergarten to grade 8, what do they need to know in grade 8 to be successful in the next matriculation? And then you start setting the scaffolding goals from there. You won't have the tendency of bringing it down, because you know we have to get them here. And then you not only come up with methods together, you start using the same pedagogical languages, you start using collaborative techniques. And what happens is, even when you can't close the gaps in a given year, that student goes into another class that will have similar language, similar practices, similar setup, similar routines. You're not wasting a whole month teaching the student new routines in their class. Or if one teacher uses the word describe all the time, but the other teacher uses the term justify, or you're using different language, and the students have to take time to learn how you mark, how you assess, and how you give instructions. You take all of that out of the equation, and you get this acceleration effect. And then the two teachers, like, you'll have a teacher that has been aware of that student's particular needs and cases that is in grade 6, but they've been seeing that case since that student was in grade 3. And they've really watched that student's educational journey until they end up in their class. And I realized just the impact that could have. I know our profession, particularly in Canada, is not set up for that. The way we do our hiring makes it very difficult to make a team that will have consistency. But just the attempt alone, I felt like, was transformative.
Can I add to that? I thought what your point about the expectations was really good. And I think that was sort of the fundamental or foundational principle behind our relationship together. With the podcast, as friends, as business partners, we noticed that the expectations was a big part of the problem. And I like what you said about it's sort of weaponizing equity in a bad way. Like it gets sold as like, let's help the student who's from the marginalized community by making the expectations lower. But the problem with that is then you set them up for failure later in life. Like, how are our students supposed to go on to higher learning and benefit their communities economically if their education has been lowered the entire time? Well, you take away that option. Like in Canada, If you have not gone into the academic stream, you're not allowed to go to university. Well, then nobody from those communities, if we consistently lower the expectations in these communities, then we're barring them from becoming doctors, from becoming teachers, from becoming psychologists, judges, accountants, and you're harming this community, and it's being done in the name of equity, and it's really, really challenging. And you're talking about the IEPs, and I think IEPs can be incredibly useful. They're supposed to be a tool for equity. They're supposed to be a tool for bringing students up who have neuro difficulties or neuroatypicalities, or are struggling for social reasons. But you look, they're much more commonly used in racially marginalized groups. You, as you point out, you had a class with 50% IEPs. That's very common in First Nation schools. Well, if they're supposed to represent things like learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities, what are the statistical odds that, learning challenges are far more difficult in Indigenous students than white students? Well, obviously there's a social cause there, not a biological cause. And unless we want to try and promote some very essentialist racist ideas, which I'm very much against, I can't accept that tenet. So it can become, again, this IEP is supposed to be something that's beneficial, and I believe in IEPs, but it can be weaponized in a way, and it can actually be done unintentionally. And this comes back to the unconscious bias. I think, sometimes when the people are lowering expectations, they think they're saying, I'm helping this person. And, what they're actually saying is, I don't believe in this person. And I think of it, I coach a lot of basketball, and I think of it in terms of basketball, don't lower the net to make it easier for the student to score, lift the kid up. Because, I remember I was teaching grade 11 English, and I was teaching how to write essays, because I knew that was a very important skill if they went on to university. And I got a lot of flack from some people about that. And they're like, why would you teach that? It's too hard. And I said, well, they can't go to university if they don't know how to write an essay. And there was just this incredible amount of flack about it. But rather than lowering the expectations, you give more help, more instructional time. You hold their hand as they learn to write the essay, because they didn't have the scaffolding previously to help them. That's the real problem. As a grade 11 teacher, the scaffolding isn't there, and they're still really learning to read and write. That is really challenging to teach them. But you have to just make it easier in terms of the instructional process, not in terms of the expectations. And that's very stressful as a teacher. But I think it goes back to something you said, Robert, with the whole believing in your students, believing all students are capable of higher learning. I remember you were the first person who brought that up to me, and I thought that was really powerful. And it made me feel more accountable to my students. Before, if my students were struggling, well, it's because my students were victims of trauma in their community, and it was a challenging situation, and there was nothing I could do. I'm a great teacher. I'm not the problem. And I think this becomes the mindset of every teacher in a challenging situation, and that's not meant to disparage anyone, is, well, it's the situation's fault. It's not mine. And I think you even look at the literature, and that's not something that's borne out. You'll look, a lot of teachers will tell you the success of their students is based off of like where they grew up, their color of their skin, the demographics. And if you look at the research, demographics have a very minimal impact on educational achievement, but pedagogy at the teacher has a massive impact. So what we do in the classroom has a bigger impact than how much money a kid's parents have.
Correct.
And you have, once you feel accountable to your students, and if the student's not succeeding, then it's not their fault for not learning the material. It's your fault as the teacher for not helping them to learn it. And I think that's an unpopular idea. Nobody as a teacher wants to be like, oh, it's my fault my kid doesn't learn. But if you don't internalize that, it becomes very hard to actually help a student when they're not succeeding, because you're not going to think, what do I need to change about myself as a teacher to help the student? You're going to think there's nothing I can do.
Right. And just to add to that really quickly, that's one of the reasons why one of the first things that we approached in our podcast was Pygmalion theory, because we recognized that when you look at the evidence, it shows what a teacher believes about the capabilities of their students is one of the biggest impacts of whether that student is going to be successful. And we looked at that as that's a product of of, unconscious bias. And I think it's not just unconscious bias of an individual. I think it's an unconscious bias of the entire institution.
Two directional.
Correct.
Right. So you can come with the idea that, all of my students are capable, but it's hard to hold on to that belief going through the institution of education the way we're meant to go through it, the way we're meant to matriculate through this profession. It is hard to hold on to that belief. And that's really the light bulb that I got that year when we were going through the RTI program. And I'm like, okay, this is something I can buy into. This is something I can buy into. And I would say that I believe the most important thing you can give to your students, if you don't have that framework of a whole school having a certain culture, you can have that framework in your classroom, and that'd be great. But I've learned over my practice that then that student matriculates out of your classroom, and you just have this feeling like, did I set my student up with all of these high expectations, which I know is the right thing to do? But how are they going to respond in another person's class? And I don't want to say that in a very arrogant way, as like I feel like they go to another teacher, they're not going to have this kind of experience. It's what I realized was I don't want to create a system that is too reliant on me as the teacher. I need to build my students as autodidactic learners. I need to build them as lifelong learners. I need to give them agency is the most important thing I can give them. Besides for literacy skills, I think the next most important thing is that agency around being a learner and that identity about being a learner. So I make sure that I instill that in my students so that they understand their role in the whole learning process, so that hopefully when they leave, they will advocate for their own education. And I feel like that's something that every teacher can do in isolation. That's something that you don't need a massive team for. You don't need a ton of resources for. That if you can just give that spark, and they can build on that through their lives, that builds the kind of resilience that we see with some learners that can come out of any demographic, as you would say, and be successful. Because at the end of the day, the statistics show that it's really about what the student believes about their own ability and what the educators and institutions believe about that student's ability. That's going to have a more profound effect on them.
Yeah, and just speaking from the nerdy statistical side of this for a second, there's always a degree of reliability behind a statistic in the sense that, a 96, when we're talking about education strategies, like if something shows a 96% improvement and something else shows a 98% improvement, there's no meaningful difference between those two. You got to sort of look at the stratifications. And this idea of believing in your student is one of the top 5 ideas out there, or pedagogical concepts out there. So much about evidence-based education has been focused on phonics. And I spent a ton of time talking on the podcast about phonics and the importance of it. But, the research behind high expectations and belief in your students is so much more powerful than the research behind phonics. Like it's about double. It's possibly the most important thing we can do as teachers. And I actually think it's incredibly easy in the sense that in itself, it's not a practice, it's a mindset. So what's easier, learning an entire new education system or just adopting a mindset? I would say the latter is. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah.
That's right. And really it's, now I'm not a teacher, but working in education, it is about the knowledge you have and continue to learn and reassess and reevaluate. But then there is that mindset shift as well. And Robert, it goes back to you talking about making those connections and reevaluating those connections as well. what's working, what's not working. Again, then connecting it to the point of us as adults or as humans being reflective people and going, what's working, but actually doing it with openness and honesty. And that acceptance and acknowledgement too, that not everything's going to be great, but it's okay. That it's a point of learning. It's a point of growth.
Right. And I would say that's very difficult as a teacher, because I know we've been very tough, and that's from love. That's like how family members can give that tough love. We've been tough on teachers, and we've been tough on ourselves. But in our defense, our profession in many ways is constantly under siege, in a way that's very different than other professions. And I know that's not the same for every place in the world. Some places in the world, education is held up as, the great equalizer and is given so much respect, and teachers are given so much respect. But I would say in North America, the perspective can often be very different. And there's always a tension between educators and policymakers. So you don't always get all the resources you need. You are constantly under siege, and being vulnerable, being open about your shortcomings, about the need to change and make improvements is very tough when there might be a political idea that wants to take away resources. And you're like, okay, we've got to protect these resources by protecting ourselves, our practice, and shielding it from criticism. But I feel like that is not serving us. And not only that, I feel like the science and evidence-based idea is actually, it's not a panacea, but it is it's almost like an antibiotic, I would say. Or that's kind of the same thing. But I mean, it's something that would benefit us so greatly, because if we had a scientific way to present our arguments, instead of trying to make it look like mysticism, when there is a political movement that comes against public education, it would be an easier debate. We would be able to be more persuasive to the real stakeholders, which are the families. But I feel like we shroud it in too much mystery. We make it look like mysticism. We make it look like, we're these artists in painting Picassos, and that's our students. And it's not serving us. I actually feel like a lot of the way me and Joseph think about the different approaches that we're going to try in the classroom and get evidence from it, we always go look and see what the research says, and then we take it and use it. But something that I've been doing recently is looking at other professions and how they really got results. So for instance, in medicine, there's something called triage. When they're in an emergency situation, and sometimes in education, it's an emergency situation, you realize what can be done right now, what is most likely to get the results to keep this person's lifelong learning potential alive. You realize you've got to strip away some things. And I don't want to say that in a way where art teachers or music teachers are thinking, no, you can't get rid of the arts and get rid of music. No, I feel like a teacher needs to be educated so that if a student is not literate and they're in grade 3, you have to spend as much time possible getting that student to the point that they're literate, because that's going to become an impediment that is going to be insurmountable. And you don't get rid of art, you don't get rid of music, you don't get rid of all these other important things. The teacher needs to be trained well enough that they can bring literacy into every subject, because that student needs the entire 6 hours of that school day doing literacy. So one of the things I've practiced the most is trying to bring literacy into every subject, except for math, because I feel like that is a different kind of literacy, and you don't want to conflate those two things. So that's the one little asterisk there. But everything else, it's When we're doing art, I bring literacy in. I tie it all together and show where literacy and art meet. And so my students, they don't just get a 2-hour literacy block, they get a 6-hour literacy block if that's what they need. And that's really the fundamental idea about all students can learn at a high level. It's like, even if we don't get the resources, we will take what we have and we will make the most of it. And we'll do it in the ways like Doctors Without Borders and triage in a clinic. And we'll take all of these methodologies and apply them to our own profession.
100% agree.
We have just a few more minutes remaining, but we've covered an amazing amount of ground in this conversation. And before we do get cut off, I'd just really like to thank you for being so liberal with the information and just having this conversation. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
It's honestly, I'm not usually this open. It's kind of been weirdly cathartic to talk about this.
Yeah, I actually think this is kind of like full circle here, because these are the kind of talks we would have. And before, we thought that maybe we should do only an audio platform so that we can have some anonymity. And now we're here kind of tying that we're completing that circle. And, the chips will fall where they fall, right?
That's it. And I'm going to tag your podcast to this, to all 3 parts of it. And but before we do end, 3 big key takeaways for anybody listening to this.
You want to take this one, Joseph?
Yeah, I think I'll give 2. You know what? I can think of, I don't know. My number one takeaway is that chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, you're a human being capable of error, and that you have unconscious bias, and that you need to start being aware of your own privilege, myself included, and that you need to start to take racism and discrimination to a very critical lens in everyday life. It's very possible and easy to do something accidentally that you have no malice behind, that has harm behind it. I think too, when you're consuming literature on any type of science, I think it's important to be really critical, because the media does a terrible job reporting on it. And that either you should be looking for people who have really high qualifications to learn from, or you should be looking to think through things like meta-analysis. Otherwise, it's very easy to make a mistake. And lastly, I think it's really important, if you're a teacher, to remember that all students are capable of higher learning. And then it's just about giving them the time and the tools they need to be successful. Robert?
Agreed. I mean, you said it perfectly. Agreed.
That can't be true.
It's not, but I'm giving you this one.
Thanks, Bob.
Oh. Well, thank you guys. And for anyone that's listening to this chapter or the 3 parts, please do share it widely. We don't know who it will benefit and who connects with what, which is the beauty and magic of human chapters, is the connection points and the honesty. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. I enjoyed the experience.